Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. In our last episode, we met the new arrivals from south of the border, seeking a new life in the land of opportunity. They brought with them the hopes and dreams of the human heart, hoping to take root in the land of liberty, away from their war-torn homeland in the United States of America. That might be an exaggeration at this point, but they certainly came in large numbers. While the 30,000 that went to the Maritimes certainly represented a demographic shift, the 12,000 that arrived in what would be Ontario represented a new world. Kingston, the largest city in what would be Ontario, had a bustling population just shy of 10,000. To put that in a modern context, the currently largest city of Toronto has a population of 7 million. We would ration that to be if 8.4 million people turned up overnight in the next 2 years. The impact would be huge. Last week, we spoke about the arrivals. This week, we're going to talk about the impact of the Loyalists on their adoptive province of Quebec, and how that didn't work out so well. It in fact led to the Constitution of 1791, dividing the province of Quebec into two new provinces. Upriver was the province to be called Upper Canada, and downriver, in what had been Quebec before its enlargement with the Quebec Act, was the new province to be called Lower Canada. The roots of the two provinces of Ontario and Quebec took a hold on the land. After we've spoken about the culture of the Loyalists as opposed to the habitants, we'll talk about the compromise legislation designed to bring peace and how it divided the administration of the two provinces. At which point, we will bid farewell to Quebec because the grounds that had become Ottawa would be a part of a new province. Obviously, it won't be a permanent farewell, as Quebec is irrevocably intertwined with the city of Ottawa. Just as we said goodbye to the French after 1759, a swift 32 years ago, France is still around, and French people are still well represented, but this is a movement in the direction of Ottawa becoming a city in Ontario. This is where the beginnings of Ontario enter the stage under its childhood moniker of Upper Canada. The Loyalists in Ontario settled around the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, and then gradually up the Cataraqui and down the Rideau from Kingston, or up the Richelieu from New York to the island of Montreal, and then up the Ottawa River. These settlers were largely enthusiastic about the Crown, landowning, and more often than not, either direct veterans or their families. These were militant settlers who carried with them an English chauvinism, an inflated sense of Britishness, and a resentment towards the United States as the land of their displacement. These traits cast a long shadow, and some of the cultural underpinnings of Ontario at its inception continue on to this day. In Quebec proper and the Maritimes, there were pre-existing communities that Loyalists could either join with enthusiasm, like Halifax, Annapolis Royal, Montreal, or others, or they would settle farms that would operate in orbits of these communities. In Upper Canada, the settlers were starting new communities and independent farms afresh. They were not there to integrate into a predominantly French-speaking, Roman Catholicism-proclaiming community. They wanted to continue being as English as they possibly could. And just as their previous communities in the 13 rebel colonies had rejected the Quebec Act as intolerable, the Loyalist colonists shared some of those opinions. They wanted to own land in freehold, not rent from a quasi-feudal lord. They wanted local religious independence for the Anglicans, Presbyterians, Methodists, and other Protestant sects, rather than the centralized voice of the Roman Catholics. They were used to the town councils and city boards of England, both old and new. The appointed advisory councils of Quebec chafed at the Loyalists and the demands of their foreign temperament, just as the Intolerable Act had irked the Americans. The Crown found itself with two very distinct halves of the province of Quebec, one of which was happy with the legal structures in place, and another that had many of the same exasperating complaints as their rebel neighbors, and the Crown was determined not to make the same mistakes twice of dismissing those concerns until it was too late. By the term the Crown, we effectively mean Sir Guy Carleton, the reigning Governor-General of British North America for 2 10-year terms from 1768 to 1778, and then again 7 years later from 1785 to 1795, and as of 1786, the first Baron Dorchester. Carleton went to London in August of 71, where he met with Prime Minister William Pitt, who passed the responsibility for the Constitution for British North America to his Secretary of State for the Home Department, and coincidentally his son-in-law, who drafted the Constitution with Carleton's advisements, and then passed it back up to the Prime Minister's office for approval. The Home Department Secretary was a quintessential British aristocrat who had never set foot in Canada and never would. Nevertheless, he had a huge impact on the distant country. Baron William Wyndham Grenville was the son of Prime Minister George Grenville, and he went to Eton College, and then Oxford, and then Lincoln's Inn. He would wed the daughter of the Prime Minister, William Pitt, and succeed him to the office in 1806. It's from him that you'll find the town of Grenville, Quebec, in the county of Grenville-sur-la-Rouge. In Ontario, you'll find the rather large United County of Leeds-Grenville, just south of Ottawa, and Grenville House at Carleton University. He drafted the Constitution Act and based it largely on the split of Nova Scotia into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. His other major contribution to our narrative is that he resigned from cabinet in 1801 when King George III refused to allow landowning male Catholics in England the right to vote, and then returned to cabinet and became the prime minister that outlawed the slave trade in the British Empire in 1807. He's a fascinating subject who is unfortunately far too outside of our focus to go into great detail. On Boxing Day, 26 December 1791, Westminster approved the Constitutional Act. This was in the good old days, before Christmas and New Year's would represent 2 weeks off. Boxing Day was just a Monday. The Act inaugurated the 2 provinces of Upper Canada, with Sir John Graves Simcoe as the Lieutenant Governor in Newark, modern-day Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Aelred Clark as the Lieutenant Governor of Lower Canada in Quebec City, both under Carleton, the Governor-in-Chief, who would take residence in Montreal when he returned from England in February of 1792. Upper and Lower Canada are often compared to Ontario and Quebec, but they were in fact mere fractions of the current provinces. The province of Lower Canada included the rivers that drained into the Ottawa from the north and the St. Lawrence and its current southern western limits. It did, however, include modern-day Labrador and excluded the lands that were a part of the Hudson Bay watershed. That was called Rupert's Land. Upper Canada included the northern side of the Great Lakes, but not the northern portion of the modern province that was also a part of Rupert's Land, with its drainage towards Hudson Bay. The terms of governance for the 2 Canadas were quite different in each province. Lower Canada kept many of its legal traditions, but it was in pre-Ontario that the legal legacy of Great Britain was imported from the motherland at the behest of the new settlers, and was markedly different from how it had been prior. In most societies, this large a change would have met with political instability, but because what became Upper Canada was so sparsely populated before the arrival of the Loyalists, and because both new settlers and imperial officials were comfortable with the new order on the land, the transition was fairly smooth. Both provinces would have bicameral administration. There was to be a legislative assembly, which would propose bills, levy taxes, tariffs, and duties, and take on responsibility for much of the administration of the province. In addition to the legislative assembly, there was a legislative council, a proto-cabinet that would make most of the serious decisions about laws in Upper Canada. There was also an executive council. That was responsible directly to the lieutenant governor and not the legislature. This council was to be appointed by the lieutenant governor, and it was there that much of the real power of the province lay. The Legislative Assembly could petition the Legislative Council, which would then petition the lieutenant governor and try to gain support amongst the Executive Council, but the supremacy of Parliament was not extended past the city of Westminster just yet. It should be pointed out that the province had much fewer responsibilities than it has now. Education was a local responsibility, and healthcare was a personal one. People who worked for the Crown included the military, the legislature, the staff of the lieutenant governor, and some dozens of bureaucrats and administrators. There were between 1,500 and 2,000 soldiers, and less than 200 legislators, staff, and other administrators that made up the entire civil service. By contrast, there are over 1.5 million people working for the province of Ontario today, and about 47,000 military personnel stationed in the province. At the time of the Constitutional Act, there were only about 13,000 people living in Upper Canada, whereas Ontario today has a population of a little over 16 million. The Legislative Assembly was elected by residents who were subjects of the Crown and owned freehold land. This was long before there existed such a thing as a citizen of Canada. A subject of the Crown is someone who had sworn a loyalty oath. This had created problems in the past, as Roman Catholics were not able to swear loyalty to the Crown as the head of the Church. This was one of the rationales behind the Quebec Act, which made allowances for Quebec's Catholic majority. So while an exception had been made for the Catholics, there were still some religious dissenters, such as Mennonites and Quakers, and some evangelicals, that were not able to comply with the loyalty oath. At this point, Jews were limited to about 200 people in Montreal and 0 in Upper Canada, so they were obviously not voting in Upper Canada. The Algonquin and other Indigenous people were not subject to the Crown as individuals, but as nations, and hence they could not swear loyalty or vote. They lived outside of the King's Peace, and the English and the Indigenous communities did not commonly mix. This also included the Indigenous people living on the Loyalist reserves at Six Nations and Tyendinaga. Despite having served in the American War, their communities were isolated from the Upper Canada political structure. The other prerequisite for voting for the Legislative Assembly was to own property in freehold. Freehold meant that you own the land and the building or buildings outright. You're not leasing, renting, sharing, or squatting. This was another strike against the Mohawks of Six Nations and Tyendinaga, who held land as a type of proto-corporation. One of the differences between Upper and Lower Canada was that in Upper Canada, only men could own land, and ownership would go to the eldest son upon the eventual death of the landowner. Because of the French Civil Code in Lower Canada, it would go to the wife. If a woman owned her land in freehold, she was entitled to vote under the new constitution in Lower Canada, but not Upper Canada, because women could not own land in their own names. This would be the case until the British North America Act of 1867, which would insist that only propertied men could vote across Canada. In Upper Canada, women couldn't vote, own land, or work for the Crown, but could own land in Haudenosaunee territory and participate in councils and rise to leadership roles. This was not the case amongst the Anishinaabe nations, including the Algonquin, where formal decision-making was considered a responsibility for the men. In an informal capacity, women could act as counselors and advisors, but still a long way from equality. While the appointed Executive Council and the Lieutenant Governor shared power to the benefit of their own selves and their own class in Upper Canada, particularly in York, Kingston, and the capital in Fort Niagara, recently renamed Newark, eventually to be renamed Niagara-on-the-Lake, towns and townships were emerging as local bastions of self-governance. As we'd mentioned earlier, the state, as it were, was very limited at this point. The small homestead communities of the Rideau River Valley and the Ottawa Valley were taking root in the territories of the new province and bringing self-governance traditions with them. Part of the Constitutional Act commanded that 1/7 of the land be considered as clergy reserves, or glebes, where the land was to be given over to the clergy to finance the construction and maintenance of a religious presence without imposing on the Central Synod. Local parishes could pay for their own administration. Local communities would also maintain local schools. Most communities, despite being very pro-British culturally speaking, had very little interaction with the Crown. Courthouses and jails would exist in a handful of urban centres at this point, called district towns, but for the most part, in 1791, Upper Canada was a series of farming communities along river valleys. The role of the province was to provide roads to bring goods to market, and a military to keep everyone safe from invasion by the Yankees or raids from the indigenous bands in the Pays en Haut in the Upper Great Lakes region. International trade was not a major part of the economy at this point, save to export to Great Britain. But it would grow as time went on. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. This show is written, recorded, and produced by me, Brendan Ray. Please check the podcast's website at ottawahistoryhub.com. It's not just a podcast you'll find there, but reviews of books about Ottawa or novels that take place in Ottawa, or historical walking tours and museums. It's a kind of one-stop shop for anyone who's enthusiastic about the history of the nation's capital. You can follow me on Facebook or Blue Sky at Ottawa History Hub, or Twitter X as @OttHistoryHub. Please take a moment if you can to leave me a 5-star rating wherever you downloaded this from, and hopefully leave a review. It helps the algorithm to promote the podcast. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at the incorporation of the first inhabited district that would become the national region, Nepean. Until then, advance Ottawa en avant!